Hi, everyone. It's probably time to get started. So welcome to the August 20th SIG Multicluster call. There's a light agenda today, so we might finish early, and it's all about E2E and conformance tests. So for those of you who aren't aware, well, the main driver behind this is part of getting the MCS API to GA, and one of the remaining items is part of one of the promises in the KEP, which was to implement 3 specific tests as E2E tests. And so John has just opened a PR that implements test 3, so thank you for that. And we've also had a broader discussion around conformance tests. The E2E tests, they test the controller that's implemented in the MCS API repo, but that's not even really a reference implementation. So there's probably value in, well, there's definitely value in having a conformance test that people can run against implementations, real world implementations, and get a report back that says your implementation is compliant with spec or it's not. And what we want to do is have a report that says item by item that's tested from corresponding to entries in the spec. Let me just share. All right, so you should be able to see the agenda for today. And we have an older document that describes what we discussed a long time ago, well, end of 2022, beginning of 2023. The tests and the interesting part with the performance tests, at least in the work that we're going to be doing in the immediate future, is this test inventory, which goes through the spec, gives links to the spec and details tests that we should be running. And so these are really individual tests, and so there's going to be scope afterwards for expanding, taking the building blocks for these tests and expanding them to allow people to run tests across a large number of clusters, for example. And so then we might want to later on refine them to be able to use that. For example, to say if you have, well, your implementation is conformant if you have a service that's available on multiple clusters. When we query it from a cluster that doesn't have it, then we see a variety of responses from different clusters, that sort of thing. We also, well, yeah, something I wanted to show people is what the report looks like now. Well, what it will look like soon. This part here, so it's very simple, but hopefully readable, and it does the job. So you get you run the test, and you get a report like this that says for each required item, whether you're conformant or not, or if we couldn't determine whether you're conformant, and it gives a link to the spec entry. So that's obviously a fake one here, just to test the unexpected error scenario. Yeah. What else did we have? Yeah, so we thought too that, well, currently we're working on this on the MCS API, but it would probably be of interest as well for other APIs that the SIG handles, like the About API, cluster properties. So there isn't the same idea in the spec of a controller behind them, so there's not the same expectation of certain behaviors when you make certain changes to objects that are described by the spec. But there are invariants that the specs assert for these. So it might be worth testing them. And that's all I had. I don't know if any of the other
Yeah, I just
yeah.
want to super boost the point that you just made, which is all of this work that's kind of going on in the background. We do think that it's probably of interest for all the other projects in the SIG, including cluster properties, to consider these types of tests to test for conformance, and just generally the idea that like as a SIG, as SIG MC, we're producing these APIs that we're like expecting third parties to like conform to, and that we could have some platform that makes it easy for them to check that. So yeah, just really want to boost that. Um, and you know, we are not going to implement all of it right now in this call, but if the folks who are like championing a lot on, for example, the cluster properties, or in the future as we are working towards more API standards coming out of SIG-MC, I think building on top of this foundation would be great. And so if we can put some brain juice towards how that might work with projects we have in flight right now, I think the same is true for About API, which is kind of in the like MCS orbit. But I think for cluster properties and cluster properties slash inventory, um, that might be kind of like a new thought, or you know, to integrate into this so we can connect about that some more. But wanted to, you know, put this on the radar. So yeah, just boosting
I,
that.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially for the more complex things like cluster inventory. It seems like it would be very helpful.
Yep. Yeah, I definitely agree.
But yeah, so, and maybe one more thing is that if I think we'll probably talk about this in the future too, or like ping on Slack chat in the future. But if anybody who's working on like working really heavily and on cluster properties wants to talk about how this could integrate, I think talking to um, me, Stephen, John is working on this. Pantelis is working on this, and Jack
Check.
Francis is also working on this. So we kind of have a little club where we're working on it in the context of MCS, but any of us could kind of like try and consult together about like how that could apply more specifically to a given API project. So yeah, hit us up.
Yep. And that's it for the agenda. So does anybody else have anything they want to bring up?
Yeah, as I've been working on the kind of validating service imports in the fields in the conformance test suite now. So I reading through the cap spec, whatever you want to call it. I just want to make sure I'm interpreting things correctly. So I see in terms of the service import. Yeah, it's pretty clear when a service export gets created, the service import is introduced in each importing cluster. Now, is that intended to be an aggregated service import? And that's what I'm understanding from this, because it talks about derived fields, derived service import, aggregated service import. I see the terminology in there. And certainly some of the fields, like the status, has a list of cluster names. So so this is intended that there is only the MCS controller, whatever that is, ends up creating a service import, an aggregated service import in each cluster, in each service's namespace in each cluster. Right? I mean, there's not a service import per cluster, in other words. That's what I'm taking from this.
Yeah, that is the common situation. So you are correct.
Okay.
I can like quadruple duple check, but I think like if an implementation had individual service imports, that wouldn't be off spec. But that is the most common situation, especially because it has that like clusters field. So that has been the intention, that
Right.
service
Right.
import can like represent all of the potential endpoints.
So I mean, you know, an implementation could create its own local or its own per cluster service imports as intermediate steps if it needs to. But in the
Correct.
end, there needs to be an aggregated. Okay.
Yep.
Got that. So now, so looking at the cluster set IP section here.
Yep.
This says, you know, a non-headless service import is expected to have an associated IP address, the cluster set IP. So this IP may be a single IP used cluster set wide or assigned on a per cluster basis. Hey, there's my confusion.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think what this is saying is that, so for cluster set IP, all of the individual pod IPs that are backing this, that could be across like whatever number of clusters, they need to be like hidden behind some aggregate IP that will route to any number of them. That's the difference between cluster set and headless, cluster set IP and headless. And what this specific sentence means is that if you're originating the request from a given cluster, that could be one IP that from that cluster, if you were hitting that IP, it can reach out to any of the backends. But if you use that same IP address from a different cluster, it wouldn't necessarily do that because it's not routed properly in that cluster. Or that you have some other like bigger cloud IPAM thing that's like more above all the clusters or something that can assign one IP for all of the clusters, cluster set wide. So regardless of what cluster you're originating the request from, it's the same IP address that can route to any of the backends. Does that help?
And I think if I remember correctly, that's something that was added for Submariner.
All right.
The exception for per cluster, but it does mean that an aggregated service import. Well, there's a bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just the wording of this makes sure. I mean, that particular, so that field IP, it's actually multiple IPs, which is sort of another.
Oh, I see. Well, I think what happens is for a given cluster, if I'm like in cluster A and I see my service import and it has a cluster set IP field, then maybe it says like 1.1.1.1, whatever. It doesn't say that, but 1.1.1.1. And then if that is the IP that works for any cluster, then in cluster B, if I saw a service import, that field would also say 1.1.1.1. But if they're being assigned on a cluster per cluster basis, in cluster A, that field might say 1.1.1.1. And in cluster B, it might say 2.2.2.2. So it's still just one IP per cluster, but it's whether like if you were God and you were looking at all the service imports across all clusters, is that field the same across all of them, or is it different across each of them because from a given cluster, the way it routes is like a different IP address that was assigned to it.
And a specific reason for that would be like if you need to plumb through traffic through an east-west gateway,
Yeah.
and a different one for each cluster versus like
Yep.
a flat topology.
All right, I'm not.
Yeah, I guess what it means in relation to the aggregated service imports is that there's an aggregated service import somewhere, but it's only visible to the MCS controller. Well, it's a notion that exists for the MCS controller. And as the service import is copied to each cluster set, it can get a different IP address. It's the cluster set IP. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a little funky.
Yeah.
It's if it's supposed to be aggregated, it seems like every cluster should have the same copy.
Yeah.
Exact same copy. So, I think that's the intention. It's just that this wording muddies that and makes it a little bit confusing. It's the part where or assigned on a per cluster basis. Now, if you have per cluster service imports, that makes sense. And then you're aggregating, like we just talked about before, the importation could have per cluster service imports and then have an aggregated one. But anyway, there's ends up to be an aggregated one. But the aggregated one, the wording assigned on a per cluster basis makes no sense to me. Aggregated means it has a cluster set wide IP, right?
The way I read this is aggregated is it's like, say you have a cluster set of 3 clusters, A, B, and C. In cluster C, an aggregated service import would have endpoints for the services or for the backends from clusters A and B. Those may have a different cluster set IP if it needs to flow through a gateway or something, for instance, but it's still the aggregate of both of those clusters rather than like a separate service import for cluster A and a separate service import for for workloads in cluster B. That is my reading of this. Does that help?
Let me try and dig up some slides from a past thing. I might need to do it offline just because I'm kind of digging through my drive that has some examples, and then we can see if there's a better way we can articulate this in the spec either way, because it sounds like it needs more explanation.
Because the per cluster IPs, the service import isn't, or at least the way it's defined, isn't designed to propagate that information. It's, optional endpoint slice would be a way to, the endpoint slices would certainly be a way to do that, right? The service import seems to be, it's supposed to be the aggregate, and I don't know, this wording here, that's that little part or assigned on a per cluster basis was confusing to me. And again, I think it seems to be confusing to others on this call because folks are struggling to come up with an explanation for it or an interpretation of it. But I don't want to get bogged down on this, this is maybe the original authors of this, maybe it was probably Laura or Jeremy, or Jeremy, maybe think about this and what makes
Yeah,
sense here.
let me mention one more thing. Let me make sure I'm saying this correctly. Okay, so the service import, like this, I don't know, can I share my screen? Let me get into that. Share screen. I
Yeah,
cannot, but
I
if
need
you
to stop
quit,
sharing first.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Give me the powers. Okay, cool. Window. This one. All right, so we're talking about this, right?
Service import IPs field. Let's ignore the fact that it's allows multiple, which is again a little.
The context there is dual stack, actually.
Okay, but okay, fair enough. But when you look at the actual service import definition, do I have it up? It actually where is it? Okay, there it is. Where's the field? In the actual code, the Go code.
Okay, sure. Yeah, could be different from
it,
this right now.
It actually has a restriction on a Q plus Q builder validation max items equal to 1. So it looks like there's some validation to only to restrict it to 1 value.
Yeah, okay. I do think this is a bit of a legacy thing. I think the reason it's called IP is, Jeremy, you can correct me if I'm not, is for dual stack, but definitely at the time that
Yep.
this was made, dual stack didn't exist.
Yes.
Yeah, so this validation is from that time, and then there has been no update relating to dual stack about making this 2, but it was never going to be like 10,000 or whatever.
Okay.
So this is supposed to represent just the IP for a cluster set IP service that like can get to all the backends.
Right.
Yep. And Laura, you used to have some really nice slides on this, but I
I know,
think
I'm trying to find my slides, man.
if you scroll way down the notes, they might be there. But I think the way that I look at this is this is the VIP to access the imported service
Right.
from the perspective of anything running in the cluster that imports the service. And this VIP can be shared across all of your clusters in a cluster set, or it can be unique per cluster. But maybe we should update the text to just kind of explicitly say something along those lines. Like it's meant to be the IP that any service running in the importing cluster can use to access a service represented by a service import. It really doesn't, there's no reason really for us to specify whether it's shared or not, or any of those constraints. I think it is perhaps confusing wording that was introduced to try to express flexibility, and maybe is instead interpreted as like either or, instead of basically, do whatever makes sense as an implementation.
And I would also
more what it meant to be.
like to back up and edit something I said earlier that might also be contributing to this confusion. So while the service import is the quote unquote aggregate, the like clusters section in it is like just names of clusters. It's not a bunch of IP addresses. And then the only connection that is explicit in here between that and endpoints is the fact that this is here in the service import, and that endpoint slices know the addresses and where is it? What source cluster those are representing from. And it so happens between then and now that even this is optional in the spec, just because there are like other platforms that can like do this off site basically. So yeah, I feel like before I said something that implied that this has a bunch of, or that this is like the aggregate in the sense that it's like holding all the IPs, and maybe it sounded like that was happening here, but that's not what's happening here. This one is definitely just the VIP. And then this gets connected to something, maybe an endpoint slice, to say what are the actual pod IPs.
Right.
Cool. Just want to make sure I didn't like
Yeah.
go on record with the wrong info there.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So Jeremy, okay. So that makes sense. Okay. You were intending dual stack. I know the cap spec doesn't say anything about, doesn't have an explanation about why this is an array of IPs. I don't know, that might be something else too.
Yeah, let's definitely add that
in there. What the intention is, because it's really intended to have one IP, but if it's dual stack, it's the same address, but in different representations or whatever. Then yeah, that makes
Right.
sense. Why you would need multiple entries in there. And it's definitely intended, well, it says IP definitely, and not any other, definitely an address, either 6 or v4, v6, not a host name or anything, right, as well. I mean, I'm getting down into some, maybe I don't need to get that level of validation, but I did put code in, it's all local, but to validate that it's an IP of some form, whether v6 or v4.
Yeah.
Which is okay. Good enough. And I was also multi-validating session affinity, because that's the section down in the conflicts section does say, talk about session affinity, so it should be propagated to the aggregated, to the service import. as well, so I am validating
Yes,
that.
that's good.
And just like a service, it should default to none as well. That's, well, it should import it from from this service, but service automatically
Yep.
puts in none.
Right.
So I mean, I have to explicitly spell that out here, but yeah. All right, good, excellent. So that, and yeah, service ports, they are a union. This says they should be a union of the, so if they don't match, so if you have like, say, a UDP port from cluster 1, and then you have a TCP port from cluster 2, the aggregate service import is supposed to reflect both of them, UDP and TCP, right? That's well, I think that's what it's saying here. Maybe it doesn't say, oh, it does say, yeah, union. It exposes a union of the service ports. Even though one of the ports may not be valid on a cluster.
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is like we needed some way to kind of represent there should be like a transient state. Like basically, if the services are meant to be different, like one of them's a TCP service, one of them's a UDP service, like I guess our answer is don't do that, is really kind of what we're trying to communicate here. Like this isn't for aggregating a bunch of disparate services. This is for representing the same service in multiple clusters.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I don't know, maybe intersection might be more appropriate. Only what's common in between them, I don't know, but
Well, I think if someone set up, yeah, I think if like the service has different, I guess, Jeremy, wow, sorry, words didn't come out of my mouth. But I think if like a user set up like basically non-fungible services backed in a service export, then I don't think at this point, at least at the service port conflict resolution stage of like actually making it to the service import, that's where we tell them, or that's where we make a quote unquote educated guess about what they want. I think we have to surface it. And then if we do want to get some other like or articulate or suggest some other error reporting along the way of like, you're weird, you put weird things together into your service or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. In the, in the condition, the conflict conditions should certainly be,
Yeah, true. Yeah.
should tell you that, and then that's a good thing.
Yeah. I don't think we should hide that from here at this conflict resolution stage.
No. Okay, yeah, I would say in Submariner when we actually implemented under the hood the intersection of the ports, not, even though we do in the aggregated service support, we put the union of them in there, but if there is a conflict like this. But under the hood, we actually utilize the intersection of them rather than the union, but that's how we implemented it,
Gotcha.
but yeah, that's cool. But it's up to
Yeah, and I think that's up to, yeah, exactly. I think that's up to the implementer. Do you want to like yell at the user like, this is weird, I can't do it, or do you just like do the best that you can with what you got and then
Oh, we yell at them. We do put a
good, very good.
conflict. We say, hey, look, wait a
Great.
minute, you're doing this, but we're actually
Yeah.
gonna do this.
Cool.
You know,
Yeah.
for you, to fix it for you or whatever, or
Yeah.
but yeah, we do communicate that. But yeah,
Cool.
I understood. Yeah, I think the union is probably the safest thing to do, and just let the implementation do what they want with it.
Yeah.
Actually use the union or spit or reject it or whatever.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. All right. Well, thank you for the time. I think that covers kind of the
Yeah. Thanks for digging in.
yeah, as you start, once you start doing, implementing these tests, that's when these details are coming
Yeah,
out.
totally.
My
Yeah.
God, what? Okay, now I got to verify.
You're keeping us sharp, man. You're keeping us sharp. Keep the edge on, SIG FC.
All right, so you are Jeremy and or Laura, you guys will look at you folks will look at the questions I raised about the IPs and the cluster set IP and kind of think about that some more, I guess, right?
Cool. Yeah.
How we want to maybe
Yeah.
clarify it in this doc. So,
Yeah. I think it
good.
can be clarified for sure.
Cool. All right. Thanks.
Any other?
I had a question, just as a new person to the project.
Hello,
So
new person.
hello. So I was wondering whether or not there was any other documentation besides the KEP, any type of flow diagrams or charts or anything like that. And if so, is it easy to find? And if there's any need to help document, I'd be happy to spend some time to help with that.
Yes, we have a cute website here, which has some more high level things in it. If you feel like it's missing stuff, that's definitely a spot to contribute, because we often have a disconnect between kind of the high level, like what are we even talking about, versus like a KEP, which is kind of like a commitment to read and get into. I don't think there's anything super open right now, but if in terms of like against that repo, but if you want to take a look at least at that site, and then if you want to contact me on chat or on GitHub, it within the repo for that website, that's a really good starting point. And then if you want to like dig into something for real, then yeah, just post on the Slack and you can ping me too, and I can at least direct you.
Okay, thank you. And the
Yeah.
other question I had was regarding the dual stack implementation as a slice with the IP. Was there any particular reason why we didn't just go with like two separate objects, like one for IPv4, one for IPv6, and then just like if you'll need to find one and not another, then it would kind of be easier to understand like the use case there.
Sorry, can you say that again? My
Sure.
brain canceled in the middle.
No problem. Yeah. So I think when you were showing the struct for the service,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Text edit closed. Okay, here it is. So when you're showing the service import struct, I believe, right? I
Yeah,
saw that there
okay,
was the
here we
IP
go.
slice.
Yeah, this
And
is actually because we were basically following the evolution of service for dual stack as well. The service was
okay,
already going with the new cluster IPs list,
I see.
and the service import is meant to match service as much as possible.
Got it. So I was wondering whether it would have made at least logically more sense to just have like an IP string, an IPv6 string, and then just create your list from those two and then pass that. I think it maybe readably, like it's easier to read from a code
I
perspective.
think consistency with the service API is the most important thing. I think that's a very reasonable alternative that but I wouldn't want to do it differently in service import than service. So like when defining dual stack, that would have been like when we probably should have explored alternatives like that.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Which was a
the
SIG
service
network
API.
project for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, specifically.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay, so it's to maintain the conformity with that.
Exactly. And we were basically
Understood.
playing catch up at this point. So this was more like, should we do what they did or should we fork? And we didn't want to fork.
Understood. Thank you. Makes sense. Well, that's all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think we can another like little mini project might even be to just like see if anything's changed on that side, the dual stack side. I think that was mentioned in chat by Mike. So I'm like super briefly on the like reference page for service, and probably there's some more places to dig for this about exactly how this is organized. So we would want to match this, but a little mini project of are we out of date right now would probably be a good research proj.
From a quick glance, it looks like we are not out of date.
Yeah,
then.
I know. That's why I'm like kind of sus. Cause yeah, so. Okay, cool. Honestly, I'll open an issue about this on MCS API, so if somebody wants to like take a look, that would be super helpful.
There's probably like additional validation we can add with like, that cell is a thing and stuff like that.
Right. So many things are a thing now. All right.
Actually, just one other thing.
Sure.
So the cluster status field there in the list of the cluster names, that is it explicitly called out in the cap? Should we validate that for conformance?
We're talking about this, right?
Yeah. So the only
Yeah.
thing is like, how do we where do we get cluster names from? In the conformance test, but yeah, that field right there. Outside of the fact that how do we validate the names are correct, or
Yeah.
should we validate this at all? Or I mean, the spec doesn't call this out and say,
Yeah.
oh, let's fill this in with the names.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
Right. I think I think first off, don't for now. It's kind of like a forgotten, not forgotten totally, but it's like it's not well defined in the
Right.
MCS API standard, and your role as a conformance test is to articulate what is strict from the standard. So yeah, I don't think you need to worry
But
about
that
it.
was my thinking as well.
Yeah.
It's not defined in there
Yeah.
what a cluster name is or where you get
Yeah.
that from or whatever. But I know you have that about there's the about API
Yeah.
that stuff
Yeah.
now. But okay, yeah, that's was my thinking too, is to leave that
Yeah.
out, at least for
Yeah.
now.
Avoid this for now.
Okay, thank you.
Totally.
Agreed on both counts. I think that there's like maybe a way that we could eventually define a relationship with about API and cluster properties, but yeah, I don't think anything currently exists for that.
All right. Anybody else? Going once. Going twice. All right. Steven, you want to close us out?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Then see you in 2 weeks' time. And on Slack and on the bug tracker on MCS API, of course. See you around. Bye.
Bye.
See y'all.